Hello and welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Julie Walker. The midterm elections are behind us, and New Yorkers, like most people around the country, are coming to grips with the results and what they mean to their day-to-day lives. On this show, we're going to look at some of the political fallout since the midterms. We're going to examine the impact of the city election here in New York and broaden our analysis to a few other key races around the country. Joining me now are political reporters Jeff Mays from the New York Times and Politico's Brendan Cheney. Thank you both for being here. So some things are staying the same. Governor Cuomo is still in office, and so is Senator Gillibrand. But a lot of things are changing. The New York State Senate, the Democrats took back the state Senate. And so what does this mean for the city, and what does this mean for the state?
I think you have a whole raft of issues now that the governor and the legislature are going to have to deal with. Issues such as codifying Roe v. Wade, the DREAM Act, immigration, all of these issues that they couldn't get past before because you had these group of Democrats who were caucusing with the Republicans and the IDC. Most of them were voted out of office. So now there's going to be no excuse as to why these issues can't be addressed.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, pent-up liberal action that they've been pushing for a long time, and the question is whether or not the Democrats can finally deliver on it, right? I think the Democratic State Senate caucus has a bit of a reputation for dysfunction, and so the question is, with this what significant majority now, right? 38, maybe 39, maybe 40 members out of 63. With that huge majority, can they deliver on what they've been saying they want to do for a long time now?
And the other issue is, Governor Cuomo has branded himself as a progressive. He has a definition of progressive. He believes he fits that. So now it's going to be his chance to see if he can actually jump on some of these issues that progressives are backing. And you have a new pressure around the state. You have, Congressman Ocasio-Cortez, for example, who is going to be a national voice on a lot of these issues. So the pressure is also ramped up on the governor as well to deliver on some of these legislative issues.
We're going to talk about some of these issues in a minute, but first, what about the legislature's relationship with Cuomo?
Yeah, I think in the past he's been able to not get pulled too far to the left because he had Republicans in control ostensibly of the state Senate. So the Assembly could push for some really liberal things, and he could say, well, we just can't do it because the Republicans are in charge. And now he might have to find ways to say no on liberal things, and I don't think he's going to want to do that because it'll make him look less progressive than he wants to look. So he's going to have to figure out ways to either say yes to things he wouldn't want to, or find ways to say no.
And like single-payer health care, for example, that's an issue now that people are saying, okay, now that you have this majority, let's get moving on this. The governor has been a little reluctant on it. He's saying, well, look, it's kind of complicated. It's not that simple. We're going to have to pull back and have discussions on it. So it's those kind of issues where you get the sense that he's not necessarily in favor of single-payer health care at this moment, as described by people. So how is he going to navigate that? How is he going to come up with something that he can live with, also keeping his progressive bona fides? But, if he's thinking about running for president in 2020, he's always kind of hewed to the center. And I think that's kind of his natural sort of political bent anyway.
Let's talk about the Health Act, because he has been quite reluctant. So where does he go now that the Democrats are controlling the Senate?
I imagine that he and they will want to take it really slow. It sounds like it's really expensive. And I don't know where they'd get the money to increase the budget as much as they need to for that. I imagine what they'll do is spend a lot of time looking into it, talking about it, really probably needing to go slow on this especially because of the cost and how complicated it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he said the other day it's really complicated. And it is complicated. It's not something that you can just plop down. And I think, though, in those negotiations, people now are going to be paying much more attention because, we have a lot more agreement than disagreement in the past. So people are going to be listening to those negotiations. What are people really saying? That's where it all comes. This is when the rubber hits the road, is in those negotiations. So it's going to be interesting to see.
Another issue is the Reproductive Health Care Act. Now, that's something that he talked a lot about when he was campaigning in the primary, codifying Roe versus Wade. So what do we see happening there?
I think this is another one of those issues where we have to wait and see if there is the support that Democrats thought there was, right? There's these issues like that and the New York State Dream Act where they said the reason it's not getting passed is because Republicans are in control. Now they're in control. The question is, do they actually have the votes to do it? And we have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think, what's happening at the national level with, Kavanaugh being on the Supreme Court now, there's going to be a lot more pressure for that to be codified into law. There's a lot of concern right now. I mean, people think of New York as a sort of progressive state, but you talk to some of the activists around, there's a concern that there could be a limit on some of these women's reproductive rights. So I think that is a top priority. The governor has said that that is one of his top priorities, is getting that codified into law. So again, it's something where we're going to have to actually see them get down to Albany, mash it out, get in the pit, and see what they actually come out with.
Speaking of women, Tish James, she became the first woman to be a state attorney general here in New York, first African American elected to statewide. So where does she go from here? What is she going to do? She had a lot of tough talk during the election. She had a lot of tough talk in terms of the Trump administration and things that the Trump administration was doing. What does Tish James do now?
I think she has a real challenge ahead of her. That office is a very nationally visible office, from prosecuting Wall Street to possible involvement in anything dealing with President Trump and his associates and that sort of prosecution going down in Washington. It's a really important office. And so, while it was easy during the campaign to talk tough about Trump, now she's going to have to actually put that into action. She announced her transition team yesterday, some very big names on that transition team. And so now she's going to have to, focus on getting the talent to stay in the office, and also get down to the nitty-gritty. The campaign is over. It's very easy to say these things about Trump, but now you have to go into office. And, a lot of people don't know, they think about these sort of cases against Trump as being the main job of the Attorney General, but the Attorney General also represents the state. So there's a lot going on. It's a complicated office, and it has sort of two sides to it. So, while you also manage these sort of very publicly viable issues that get a lot of attention, there's also the sort of nitty-gritty work that goes on behind the scenes of defending the state.
Yeah, it's a big jump from the offices she's had in the past, city council member and public advocate. And so, we're going to wait and see how she manages a much bigger office with a lot more responsibility.
Speaking of the office she had before, the public advocate, now that seat is open, and there's been discussion about, are we going to eliminate it, or is there, there's already so many people interested in running. I think the last count might have been something like 8 had at least mentioned it at some point, and that could create a domino effect. I mean, we have O'Donnell, who has mentioned it. He put on his Facebook page, what do you think? So we have a couple of other people, too, a couple of big-name people, Melissa Mark Viverito, the former speaker.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. I think I talked to O'Donnell on Election Day. He's told me he's definitely running for that seat. Jumaane Williams, who ran for lieutenant governor and really got a lot of votes. I think he got 414,000 votes in New York City. So there was an immediate push for, once he lost, to consider running for public advocate. So he's going to be interested in it. Another former speaker, Christine Quinn, is another candidate that's been mentioned. Michael Blake, assemblyman from the Bronx and a member of the Democratic Party leadership, has also thrown his name and announced that he's going to run. So it's going to be a really interesting race. It's going to happen in the middle of winter. It's a nonpartisan election. I don't know if voters may have a little voter fatigue after this season. This has really been an intense election season, combined with the sort of voting problems that we saw people coming to the polls having in New York City. So this is going to be a race that's all about turnout. It's going to be all about ground game. Jumaane Williams also got the endorsement of the working family parties the other day. So that's going to be a big deal in terms of helping him get out the vote, getting that ground support and raising money.
Yeah, and it could be that with so many people in the race, right, also some current city council members who might want to jump in, that with so many people in the race, a relatively small coalition might deliver victory. And so you got to pay attention to that. And I think a lot of people see it as a springboard to higher office, right? You consider the last 2 public advocates. Bill de Blasio became mayor Tish James is Attorney General, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of competition for that because it seems like a springboard.
Yeah, and that's why I thought it was interesting that Jumaane has said that he will not run for mayor. We know that can change. We saw what happened with Gillibrand saying that she won't run for president. So it's interesting if he can convince these sort of mayoral contenders to back him by saying he's not going to use it as a springboard to run for mayor. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out versus the other candidates who are clearly very ambitious as well.
Let's talk about the back of the ballot. In the city here, there were the 3 ballot questions. A lot of people might have either not known they were going to be there or not realized, but they overwhelmingly voted yes to the 3 questions from the Mayoral Charter Revision Commission, right? So lowering the amount of campaign finance contributions a candidate can receive, establishing a civic engagement commission, and setting term limits for community board members. So what are these 3 things actually mean now that they've passed?
Well, I think there were 3 things that, as complicated as they really were, they seemed simple when you went into the voting booth, and I think that's what benefited them and led to their passage, right? Term limits, people love term limits. A commission to, increase voting turnout, that sounds great, and lowering campaign limits and increasing matching funds all sound really great, right? So there is that. Yeah, I think the question is, what impact do these things have? Who does it help with the lower campaign limits? Does the commission is it able to expand voting and maybe make the process easier, even though it's working against a separate board of elections? And does term limits actually serve its purpose of diversifying the community boards?
Yeah, this was a big victory for the mayor. He was touting this in the days after the election. All 3 questions passed. At my own voting booth, I heard 2 senior citizens speaking, and they were saying how they didn't understand the questions, but they just voted yes on them. And I think that had to be the case in a number of situations. I think the real issue with the community boards, I've covered community boards for a few years, and you hear people say that, look, there's no line to serve on these community boards. They actually spend time looking for people to volunteer, come, on wintry nights, come out of their homes, away from their families and children, spend 2-3 hours talking about some of these issues, which can be complicated, difficult development, all issues that really affect the neighborhood. So I've heard some concern about how limiting those terms is going to take effect. It's going to be a few years. Mayor de Blasio will be out of office by the time this takes effect. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that.
So let's shift our attention to the national races. Okay, so this idea of the blue wave, I mean, we saw that on Staten Island, and so what do you make of our new Democratic congressman from Staten Island and part of Brooklyn?
It'll be interesting to see if he can hold the seat, right? He's a Democrat in a seat that is somewhat conservative. So is he a one-term congressman like previous Democrats in that seat have been, I think? And how does he interact with the majority? How does he help the majority? I think he tried to avoid talking about President Trump and tried to avoid talking about Democrats. But once he's in there, does he work with Democrats to help them give them their majority?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. He spends a lot of time, even criticizing Mayor de Blasio. And Staten Island is a very interesting place. People think of it as a Republican sort of stronghold, but you actually have more registered Democrats out there who tend to vote Republican on a lot of these issues. So it's interesting to see how he's going to fit into this new Congress where there has been this sort of rolling blue wave, to see where he gets in. How does he bring those issues back to his voters out in Staten Island, some of whom tend to lean more conservative, but made a different choice this time.
How does it help the city to have him here, to have him in Washington? How does it help?
Well, I think his position is definitely, in the middle. So he might be questioning some of these issues that are coming up, some of these progressive issues. It was a blue wave, but there was also a lot of progressive issues that took place across the nation. If you look in Florida, where they restored voting rights for felons, and other places across the country where medical marijuana and marijuana was legalized by ballot. Medicaid was expanded in a couple of states. So I think in New York, which definitely has a reputation for being more more progressive. It's going to be interesting to see how he fits in. He is a Democrat, but he's not your traditionally, left Democrat in New York City. So it's going to be interesting to see how he fits in this sort of progressive wave that's taken effect.
Yeah, and it always helps to be in the party that's in the majority, right? So it'll help his district and help him. And I think to the extent that he's seen as at risk, he might get more support from leadership to try and help protect him in the next election. And he can use that to help his district, probably.
So what do the Republican losses tell us about what's coming up?
I don't know. It's kind of, it's weird to see because in New York, obviously you had members of the IDC sort of get swept out of office. And, I think people thought that group would take some losses, but it was really overwhelming. 6 of 8 were pushed out of office. So I think it says that New York is definitely making a statement about where their political leanings are, that the state is definitely leaning more left. You have a lot of stars here. Ocasio-Cortez is going to be, people are going to be watching her very closely to see if she can push some of these progressive ideals into office. So I think there's going to be a question of, how progressive is New York, and are these ideals really going to play out? Is the Senate really going to pass a lot of these these really super progressive ideas? Now's the time for the real answers to come forward.
Yeah, and I think that it'll be interesting to see the Democratic House and how they interact with Trump, right? Do they go are they really aggressive, which might cause some voter backlash? Or do they moderate themselves a little bit while still sort of serving the Democratic appetite for really aggressive oversight of the president?
So what about Trump's White House post the midterms?
He's been pretty angry these last few days, been answering questions from Robert Mueller. I think what this election shows is that, talking about some of these issues might be more important than focusing on the president himself. The president himself has a very sort of defined political game. He goes out, attacks people, very angrily, and the question is, are voters going to respond to that, or are voters going to respond to you saying what you're going to do for the state? Are you going to address these sort of long-standing issues that are outstanding in New York that we have control over here, or are you going to focus on President Trump and his sort of angry rhetoric?
Yeah, and I think we have to wait and see whether the president finds ways to work with a Democratic House and Republican Senate on things like, a big infrastructure plan, whether that was a real thing that he was pushing for, and on the budget, right? Is he able to find a way to compromise with the Republicans in the Senate and a Democratic House, or is there a shutdown, right? So I think those are the looking to see how Trump can handle this divided legislature.
And I think one issue in New York is, for example, would be the Gateway Tunnel. You talked about the infrastructure. Is that project going to move forward now? That's building a tunnel between New York and New Jersey that's desperately needed. We see what happens when that tunnel goes down. Train traffic is pretty much stopped. And just the larger sort of infrastructure, that will be a big signal, because it's an issue that both sides of the aisle agree on, that, we have huge major infrastructure projects in the Northeast that affect the entire nation. So if we can't find common ground and get those done, it's going to say a lot about the rest of the term.
Well, Nadler and a few other Democrats are well positioned now that they've taken back the House to do some of these things that they've wanted to do for a while. Do we see anything coming down the pike because of that?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, it's so hard to know how much not just the Trump White House, but also the Republicans in the Senate will want to find common ground on things, or whether we'll just have 2 years or more of gridlock. Yeah, I mean, I think Senator McConnell has sort of said, are the Democrats going to work with us, or are they going to just fight all the time? But I think that the question could then be asked back to him also.
Well, talking about infrastructure and things going on in New York City, let's talk about Amazon. That is a hot topic. People who don't normally talk about things like that on my Facebook page have been mentioning it. So where do we see this going? Because it's not going away anytime soon.
I mean, the issue is, should New York City and New York State be giving the richest corporation in the world these sort of subsidies, that add up to, I think, approximately $3 billion in subsidies in terms of land and other issues, when New York has these other pressing issues such as infrastructure and the MTA, which is crumbling and falling apart. I think it's going to say a lot about Mayor de Blasio and both Governor Cuomo, who call themselves progressives. They're having their progressive bona fides called into question now by the fact that they're giving Amazon these subsidies. The big question to me is going to be, what's the effect going to be on people who live in Long Island City, for example? There's already rapid gentrification there. Housing prices are already very high. The other question is the jobs. Who's going to get those jobs? Are those jobs going to be people who live in New York City, or are they going to be people coming from outside of New York City? The average salary is $150,000 at Amazon. Are people who live in Queensbridge houses, for example, the largest public housing complex in the country, which is right near their new headquarters, are those people going to benefit from the jobs at Amazon? So that's the really big question that both the mayor and the governor are really being pushed right back on now. And you see them really feeling the heat. They are really having to go out and explain why Amazon qualifies for these subsidies.
Yeah, I don't think they expected this strong of a backlash against the Amazon deal. I think they thought it was going to be a great victory lap, great thing that they can take credit for in the city and the state. So I don't think they expected that. The question to me is whether or not the people who are opposed to it, do they really want to stop it, and can they stop it, or is there some sort of way where they can negotiate a different deal with less subsidies and sort of take credit for that? But that's what's going to be going on, I think, in the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sort of political game going on here. I'm sure the opponents, I've heard some of the opponents say, look, we're not opposed to Amazon coming here, bringing jobs. The question is, should Amazon be giving more to the city than the city and state are giving to Amazon? So this could be just a negotiating ploy in order to try to get more concessions out of Amazon.
I mean, is there any going back and getting anything more? Do we know if it's possible to renegotiate at this point, or is it just a done deal?
I mean, the big issue has been whether these subsidies have to go before the Public Control Board, I believe, and at the state level that would have to approve some of the subsidy. There's been back and forth in the last few days. Some people said, this $500 million in state subsidy does have to go before that board. Some people the governor's office is now saying that it doesn't have to go. So I think that's where it's going to be the opportunity to sort of make some change and get some concessions over it. But we already see this is just going to be a huge political fight in the coming months about an issue that is gaining national attention. I mean, it was a national competition. And, the argument is that Amazon needs New York more than New York might need Amazon.
And one of those people who did question this was Ocasio-Cortez. So let's bring the conversation back to her and the other women who are taking office. I mean, they've all broken barriers. What does this say, and what does it mean? And is it really going to make a difference?
I think so. I mean, it seems like, at least, early on, that Ocasio-Cortez is willing to really be vocal about issues on the far left. And stand up to her own party, whether it's Cuomo and de Blasio on this, whether it's Speaker Pelosi, and to really be a thorn in their side. And if we can judge her future based on what we see now, I think that there's going to be a lot of that pushing people in power to the left.
Yeah, banner year for women in Congress. I think we have 100 women serving in Congress now, and for the first time, more than 20 African-American women. So it's going to be interesting to see what direction they can pull the Congress in. We know that women bring up a lot of issues in terms of, reproductive health care, child care, issues that sometimes get pushed to the back burner, but that women have been strong supporters of for a long time. Fair work, wage benefits, the wage gap. So these are all issues I think we're going to see these women bring up. I think it's going to be very interesting with this new base of women in Congress, and also this new base of African American women who really have leverage now, because we've seen African American women be the backbone in a lot of these elections. They've saved Democrats time and time again in many states. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of power those women can pull from that leverage that they have.
Any predictions for 2019 and 2020 especially? Anything? Any thoughts go through your head?
I mean, I think that two things. One is I don't think that we can judge the presidential election based on the midterms, right? I feel like each election can be very different. So there's not really a trend line to follow. And I think the primary is going to be, I feel like the primary to me for the president, for the Democratic presidential candidate is going to be similar in a way to the public advocate, right? There's going to be a lot of people who really want to be involved, I think. And so I think it's going to be a big, big competition, unlike 2016, where it was mostly just Hillary's race to lose.
Right. Will Bloomberg be jumping into any of this?
It certainly looks like he's giving it serious thought. He had some big victories in these elections. I think his $20 million, I believe, that he raised, crediting a lot of that, or maybe more than $20 million, but crediting that money that he raised and gave to candidates as being part of it. I think it's part of this bigger question of where Democrats are going, right? He's clearly going to be a more sort of centrist Democrat, and the question is, where's the party headed? Is the party going to be leaning more left, more progressive based, or do you want someone like a Bloomberg who's more centrist, more business minded, more business friendly? That issue, along with the issue of how are you going to deal with President Trump? Are you going to ignore President Trump, or are you going to go at him strongly, or are you going to just focus on getting things done, getting issues done that you can show that we have these accomplishments in spite of President Trump? So I think that's one of the biggest issues for the Democrats. How are they going to play this next election?
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Jeff Mays and Brendan Cheney. And thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.